Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. In this video I'd like to give you guys an update on my bamboo plants and also on my rice plant. So they've grown a lot since the last video, and the short time lapse I had at the very beginning of this video was actually from my Moso Bamboo, which is this one here. Now I did have to cut that time lapse short because it was showing quite a bit of damage on the lower leaves. I thought originally it was maybe either dry air or because it had 24-hour lighting on it, although that damage has continued for a little bit, so that's why I didn't have the time lapse going for too much longer, because it started to show it was suffering. But as you can see, even from that time lapse it has grown quite a lot. And I'll show you a very quick picture now of how they looked in the last video update, and you should be able to see there's a huge difference, especially with the rice plant at the back there. So the growth has been very rapid, and because of that I'll have to repot my rice plant today into a bigger pot. I'll start off with the bamboo plants though and talk about how they've been doing. And I've got two now to show you, whereas in the last video I had one with just probably about 2 or 3 leaves, and the other one was actually just a root, so there was nothing to show in that video. So these are my two Moso Bamboo plants, known as phyllostachys edulis. These are some of the tallest bamboo in the world, for temperate areas anyway. I've been growing these from seed for a few weeks now, probably about 2 months in total. So this is the first one that germinated. And this is a similar stage as where this one was in the last video, which I think is about 6 weeks worth of growth. The growth tends to be exponential, as the more leaves it has, the more growth it puts on. This one, as you can see, is looking quite healthy, but it has got one leaf starting to go brown. I'm not sure why this is happening on my bamboo at the moment. I think it's probably overfeeding. I think I've been too eager to get these to grow really fast, so I've been giving them lots of feed and putting them in a high temperature environment. And I think it's just been a little bit too much feed for them, especially as they are quite young plants and they're not really quite ready to be given high levels of feed. So I'm going to ease off on the feeding. I won't feed them at all, probably for a month or two, see what happens. If the growth weakens, I'll start feeding again, and hopefully that should clear up any of this kind of dry kind of damage to the leaves. So you can see the leaves come through perfectly healthy originally, and then as they get older they kind of go yellow and look less healthy. So the growth on this one has been quite interesting. Normally with bamboo, especially mature bamboo anyway, when you have a shoot, that one shoot grows and then stops growing before the next shoot appears, whereas it appears with the young bamboo until they're into a mature phase. The new shoots come up before even the original one has stopped growing, and that's what's been happening on this one. But the new shoots, they always become larger than the original one, even if the original one has been growing for longer. So you can see here, this is actually the original shoot here, which is why it has so many dry and dying leaves. And it's now probably the second tallest shoot, I think, and it has actually got a small branch on this one as well. But you can see this one is now overtaking it, and the leaves on this one are starting to get larger. Every time they're getting leaves, they're getting bigger. But this newer one has actually overtaken it and starting to get even bigger than that. And this one will eventually become about twice the size of this one. And you can tell this one's nearly finished with growing, because it's starting to curve over slightly, and also the leaves are very close together. Whereas on this one, the leaves tend to be slightly further apart. So that's an indication of how mature the individual stems are. We've now got 2 new shoots coming from the base as well. These 2 new shoots should grow faster and bigger than this one, because these are newer ones. And I think there's a very small one right down the bottom just starting as well. So there's several coming up. It's looking quite good. As I say, I'm a bit worried about the drying leaves, but hopefully that's just overfeeding, and we've given it a break from fertilizing. This should recover, hopefully. And it certainly looks like it should be exponential growth. As the more leaves it gets, the more stems it will grow. So it'll be interesting to see how this does. I'll give you guys an update on these whenever they're at a big change in their life, so probably in 2 or 3 months time. I'm going to have these under grow lamps just to keep them growing over winter. I'll just give you a comparison now with some other bamboo that I've grown from seed in the past, to give you an idea of how much faster and how much thicker these plants grow, because these are giant timber bamboos, than a smaller bamboo which only grows to about 3 meters at maximum size. This plant here is probably 4 or 5 years old. It's a bamboo I've been growing for several years. It's been outside in the garden, which is why it's looking a bit sorry for itself. It's been very windy recently, and it's been frosty as well, so the leaves have been damaged by that. That's quite common. The leaves often get damaged by the frost, and then it comes through in spring with no problems. But you can see this one, the stems on here, even though these are quite well, relatively mature in comparison, the stems are very thin. This is a 5 or 6 year old plant. the stems are still stick thin, like really thin stems. They're not thickening up at all. Whereas if you look at the Moso Bamboo, which is so much younger and so much smaller, the original stems, you can see there, were incredibly thin, similar to the more mature bamboo, but it's already, even with the newer growth, starting to thicken up. Whereas this one, it grew thin stems to begin with, and the stems always remain thin. And I've got a division of this plant here that I took a couple of months ago, and you can see there, even these newer shoots coming up are just as thin as the older, smaller shoots. So this tends to just grow lots of thin shoots, and you can probably tell when you're growing bamboos from seed if it's going to be a giant bamboo or not by how quickly the stems start to thicken up. So as I say, this was never going to grow into thick canes, so they've remained small. Whereas this one here, even into its second month of its life, its new canes are already getting much thicker than its original one. So that's probably an indication if your bamboo is ever going to become a giant type of bamboo. So this is the rice plant. This is an African strain of rice. Basically, I just found a grain of rice in my packet of rice which hadn't been shelled and still had its original seed coat. So I put it in the soil and it germinated almost straight away. This is probably about 3 months old now. As you can see, it's really getting quite a size. Height-wise, it's kind of slowed down the speed of its growth upwards, but it's still really quite large. It's probably about a foot tall now. But what I started doing recently is starting to tiller, and what happens with a lot of cereals and grasses is to do what is called tillering. Basically, you have the original plant, which is kind of this stem in the middle here, and then it puts up all these side shoots. So what it's been doing recently is, instead of putting on too much more height, it's been putting on loads of side shoots, and the whole plant has just been getting a lot bigger, a lot thicker. And you can see even this side shoot here has started to get side shoots. So it's just the whole plant's bulking up. It's going to give me a much bigger plant overall. And there's a few kind of branches from higher up as well. So what this is probably going to do is it's going to put out a few more tillers. I think it's almost finished with tillering. And then once it's finished tillering, all these tillers will then start growing, and the middle shoot as well. And the whole thing should just get much bigger in size. This kind of rice should grow about 1 meter in height. I'm not too sure. Looking online, that seems to be the height that this should get to. Some rice plants only grow 1 or 2 foot tall. Other rice plants, they can grow up to several meters, especially the floating varieties. They can grow really quite long. So this one should grow about 1 meter, I reckon. But it's really starting to get too big for its pot now. If I pull it out of here, you should be able to see it's getting quite pot bound. Got good healthy roots though. Even though it's in a pot without any holes in the bottom, because rice doesn't mind being waterlogged, what I tend to do is give this a really good soak and then just let it dry out ever so slightly. And it seems to absolutely love that. It doesn't mind being waterlogged, and as long as I let it dry out a little bit, it just lets a little bit of air into the roots again. Because even though rice can tolerate waterlogged conditions, it's not its favourite conditions. So I'm going to repot the rice plant into this pot because there's no holes in the bottom of this, so it means I can have it nice and waterlogged if I want to have it waterlogged. And the way I'm going to water this, I'm going to keep it quite wet all the time, so I'm quite happy for it to get sodden at the bottom. So the compost I'm going to use is mainly a rich multi-purpose compost, because this seems to benefit really well from high feed levels, and the rich multi-purpose compost contains a huge amount of water holding capacity because there's a lot of organic matter, so that's going to hold plenty of moisture. But naturally, where rice plants grow, they grow in paddy fields, there's not high organic matter in the soil. So this is about half rich organic multi-purpose compost, and the other half is loamy soil-based compost. So there's a lot of silt in here. They actually grow in a silty clay soil, so this should recreate that a little bit. There might be a little bit of perlite in here just because I had a bit left in the bottom of the mix, but I'm not actually putting perlite in for any reason because it's not needing the drainage. I just want something that holds plenty of moisture and has a bit of a silty clay mix kind of constituency, so that is similar to what it is in its natural environment. So that's the rice plant now potted up into its new pot. The only difficulty I might have now is because it's raised up in height, it's not going to be a lot of space in my grow box for growing it anymore. So the issue I'm going to have is I need to keep this warm in the tropical conditions with high light levels, but it's now winter in Scotland, so the only way to do that is to have it in a grow box. But the problem is none of my grow boxes are much more than 2.5 foot tall, so it's kind of difficult for me to get the height, so some of the leaves might get a bit scorched. or they might just kind of be shaded out because they'll be too high and past the grow light. So this plant might have to grow later on in a different kind of environment, such as the sunny windowsill, or maybe a grow lamp that's not in a grow box. So this is probably going to grow really, really well for the next month or so. It's going to put its roots into that bigger area of soil, put on huge amounts of growth with the strong light intensity of the grow box and the high temperatures. But then when it gets too big, I'll have to take it out of the grow box, and it'll probably slow right down and suffer a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see how this does. And you'll probably notice I repotted it slightly deeper than it was originally. With most grasses, because they're monocots and they grow from the base, you can bury them deeper than they were originally in the pot, and it's normally completely fine. And especially with rice, as it's used to waterlogged conditions, having the base constantly wet isn't a problem at all for it. It'll grow quite happily like that. So I'll give you guys an update on these in a few months' time. We'll see how this does. I suspect you'll probably see a lot of burnt foliage towards the top where it's been touched on the grow light and it's been getting damaged. But generally this should be a lot bigger, a lot fuller as well, because a lot of these tillers are quite small still and they're going to get a lot larger. So it'll be interesting to see how the rice plant does. And when it comes to flowering of the rice plant, tropical plant needs a very long growing season. So I would think we're still probably 3 or 4 months away from flowering. I think this will probably flower kind of middle of spring next year, but we'll see how it does.